Introducing the entirely new 2001 Aurora by Oldsmobile. You whip through curves precisely.
The other night I was driving home on a dark piece of road near my house and ran over something in the road. It was a pretty major thing. I'm thinking like a small brick or a big brick, small concrete block. Anyway, it bent the tie rod. So I have a replacement tie rod end, because this way if I damage the other one getting it out, plus put a new one in is a good idea anyway. So put the car up on a jack stand and pull the wheel, and then I'll bring you back. Well, I am sure that I'm lucky it wasn't worse than that, but that is supposed to be straight. That is not supposed to be bent like that. So it screws in back in here, so I need to take that off. That was one of the replacement pieces, and like I said, I'm just going to replace this one. But let's remove the end of this tie rod from the spindle. After removing the cotter pin, I spun off the nut, removed the washer, put the nut back on the other way so that that surface was facing down. It was flush with the end of this stud coming out of the tie rod end. Tapped on the side of the spindle to get it loose out of its tapered fit, and then a quick tap on the end and it was loose. So the next thing I need to do is remove that boot back up in there to expose where the tie rod screws in. Tie rod is threaded. This end here, which is female end, will go into a shaft that comes out of the rack. So the manual says this job requires taking out the steering rack. Well, let's see what we can do with the steering rack still in place. I need to get that silver band off, which is holding the bellows or boot on. Got a pan here in case fluid leaks out. So I've got different tools here. We'll see which one works to get it loose. With these, a lot of different names. I just call them heavy duty wire cutters. That is off. So now we should be able to slide that off, but it feels like it's being bound in place by something. Oh, there we go. And there's the fluid that I thought might escape. Alright, so that is off. And the rest of that band is there. I guess by tilting the car on one side, hopefully we've got all of the fluid to one side. That is something. We'll have to figure out what that part is. Anyway. Go a little farther here, see what we get. We have to work from the other side. So I'm going to remove this tie rod end, and to do that you loosen that jam nut that takes that off. With reaching back in here, I can feel the part of the rack that I have to hold with a wrench in order to unscrew this tie rod length here. So with this out of the way, it'll just be easier to work, this being the tie rod end. So with a wrench holding across these flats and one on this, I was able to turn it in what I thought was the loose direction, and that freed this up to turn. So I will count the number of turns and bring you back when I've got those off. 21 turns got me off of that. Now again, I need to go inside, put something way back in here, and that should allow me then to vice grips. Actually, there's flats on this. Turn that out. Okay, the boot is, or whatever that cup over the outside is, pulled back. The instructions, let's see if I can get back to, okay, the instructions talk about that wrench going on there, and then a small pipe wrench inboard to hold the shaft of the, now that I've pushed that cup back, I need to hold the shaft while I'm on the end of this new tie rod with a wrench. And then it appears, given the way that they're doing it, it unscrews like you would think. So I'm going to go get my smallest pipe wrench and come back. So I'm going to work from smallest to largest. Hopefully that one will be enough grip to hold it. And we'll get the wrench that fits that flat and use it underneath. Wish me luck. That is the now exposed threaded male end on the, from the rack, in the rack and pinion. And it pretty much worked how they said, except for the fact that the flat for the, we'll call it the female part, was not in a position that I could get a wrench on. So I used my bigger pipe wrench around the body of that and the smaller pipe wrench to hold the shaft, keep it from rotating. And I also turned the wheel enough to expose just enough of that portion of the shaft to get a grip with the pipe wrench, not disturbing that, which meant that this rack had to kind of go towards the driver's side, as if I was turning the car to the passenger side. Again, just enough to get that little wrench on there. Too much and would have put that hub too far back behind all of this chassis plates and such. So it all worked out. Thank you, Lord. Now we'll put the new one on and get everything back in. I've greased that portion as best as I can force grease down in there. I've turned it and torqued it as best I could, that end of the tie rod. And then I also dimpled the end. You can kind of see, I can't really point at it, but that will prevent it from backing out. So now I'm going to slide that blue, they call it some sort of shock absorber, I guess, if you crank the wheel all the other way, and then put the boot back on. Up at the top there is a silver, and it won't focus, but there's a silver breather tube that has to insert into the little side tube on the boot. And so I make sure that's lined up and everything else is pushed on. And now I'll get a zip tie. I've got a metal band coming, but for the time being I'll put a zip tie on there. Alright, the zip tie is on. It's on there pretty snugly, but again, it's plastic and heat's going to affect it, so eventually the metal one that I get will go on to seal that off. The other thing that I did, I forgot to mention, was I tied down those that power steering line so that it would stay out of the way. Zip tied it down, but I removed a screw on a clamp there, so I'm cutting that now and then reinstalling that screw. So with the wheel turned all the way to the left, that extends the tie rod out as far as it goes. I was then able to get that little band of the bellows or the boot to be most exposed. Slide that clamp on and put it on around there with needle nose pliers. So I fitted the Zerk fitting on there, pumped some grease into that whole assembly. I've got the jam nut in place, so now I'm going to install this 21 turns, and hopefully we're good enough to drive. I took the Oldsmobile in for an alignment after replacing that tie rod end and was told that the strut is bent. So I've got a pair of replacement struts that I'm going to install, at least start with the passenger side, the one that was bent, tonight. I've got to take the car to the mechanic to have the camshaft position sensor synchronized with the crankshaft position sensor tomorrow. So I don't know how far I'm going to get, but the directions seem pretty straightforward. Just like most cars with strut front suspension, I will have to do a removal and replace of the spring from the old onto the new. So we'll jack it up, put it on a jack stand, pull off this front wheel, and go from there. Alright, so we've got these two bolts that hold the strut at the bottom, and then there are going to be 4 at the top. I'm going to need to remove anything that's attached to the strut so that it is free to come out. There are 3 screws that hold the top in. You can see down in there. One is down in there, one is there. I'll use a 15mm socket. Then come down here. The bolt uses a 21mm on the head of it, and then it looks like a larger nut socket on the other side. Alright, it's important to note that this bolt has got these knurls. You don't spin the bolt off. You tap it on the end, and that will drive it out. So I've done that on one. I will do that on the second one, and it should be ready to come out. Alright, so the strut is out. The trick was to let the end drop down into this opening here, carefully protecting this sticking out and the tie rod end. That allowed the top to swing out through the opening here in the wheel well. So now I get my spring compressors and move that spring to the new strut. Alright, so it's important before I take anything off that everything goes back on the way it is now with the new strut. So this cap fits over top of the long retaining bolt. There's a replacement of those. I grabbed the coils that I could and pressed them as far as I can, and we shall see if that's enough. I look at the ends of the spring in case things literally fly apart. There is the end of the spring goes up against a little pocket there in this plastic damper, and a rubber damper, and it appears that it can only go on one way with that knob sticking out there and a knob back there. The other end is just gonna go where it goes. Right now, the end of the spring, yeah, see how this top is just free to spin, because again, when you steer the car, it's got to rotate on something. So, all right, we will begin loosening that bolt. It'll be nice to see the end of that spring. Okay, it's right in line basically with where this key pin is. All right, sometimes this happens that there's not enough restriction. No, there's not enough friction to hold that inner rod to keep it from spinning. So it is a Torx bit down in the inside of that, and then I will hold the nut with the wrench because I don't have a 24 millimeter wrench and a 24 millimeter combination wrench, so I'm stuck with a crescent wrench, and then just spin the nut off while holding the Torx in place. Alright, so the nut is loose. This cup faces out. This cap just pops off like that, and there doesn't appear to be anything to locate. Alright, so then there is something else. Upside down. All right, two hands to, oh no, there it is. So that's off of that. It goes on there. And that goes on there. And the spring pops off. And then this boot should slide off. Okay. And we'll compare that to the other strut. I think that is all that needs to be replaced. Maybe this plastic piece will have to come off. We'll see. In order to release the center rod, you actually stick a hex wrench in the top there, rotate it counterclockwise until it all of a sudden just magically rises on out. So now we'll put everything back in the reverse order of it coming out. Took a hex key, it's a metric hex key, and then a 15/16, and then just spinning them opposite to each other, tighten that down to where it bottomed out, and everything is on. So we'll reinstall it back onto the car. Hopefully this is the last time I have to deal with this. Had some vibration after the last alignment, and it was still pulling a little bit. So I took it back to the alignment shop, and they said wheel bearing is bad. So sure enough, I don't know if you can hear that, but it's definitely loose. So I have a replacement hub and bearing in that box, and directions in the book. So let's get going. Okay, wheel bearing hub replacement. So I have removed the wheel, and I have removed the nut. So I removed the nut here. I had the 34 millimeter, which didn't feel totally right, but I was very careful in using the breaker bar instead of the impact to get it loose off of there. So that is off. So the next step is remove the brake rotor. Okay, got it. So by turning the wheel all the way to one side, I was able to use the impact gun and get to the screw on this side. Reversing, I was able to get to the screw on the opposite side This one on the top, I could not get a straight shot with the impact, so it was safer anyway. I put the 13mm on there, the extension, and then had to use the breaker bar to get it loose. But it is loose, so we can now work it back. By the way, I sprayed all of them with PB Blaster. So this should, I know that the shaft down the center here is loose in the spline. I sprayed that too. So hopefully with this last one it will come out relatively easily. We shall see. So by tapping at the back corner, fortunately it came out. The end of the attachment for the ABS sensor goes into that opening in the plate. So you squeeze in these two tangs that are sticking out from the side with the needle nose, and it just falls out. So once that is out, I guess we need to figure out how this somehow, well, I think I have to push the CV joint back in order to make a space for that to go through. So 2 hands required. Going back on, in this case, was easier than coming off because I just used the 3/8 drive with an extension, and because everything was smaller diameter, I could fit and get the backside of these 3 retaining bolts just fine. Snuck the connector back through between the hub opening and the CV boot, clipped it back into its holder, plugged it in. So those 3 bolts are all tight. Next thing I will do is put the rotor and the caliper parts back in. So the rotor's back on, the caliper bracket is on, the brake shoes are in, and now I am retracting the caliper piston slightly with that C-clamp. I just needed like 1/8 of an inch at the most. All right, something I forgot to mention was I cleaned out the area of the hub where the new bearing housing bolts into. I also put anti-seize on the inside of that. I put grease on the splines. I put anti-seize on the bolts that hold the hub in. I'm sorry, the bearing housing in, as well as the brake caliper and the brake caliper bracket. So all of those have got anti-seize on them. And now it's just a matter of putting the wheel back on and getting it off the jack stand. So how many of you said, no, wait, you've got the nut to put on the end of that CV joint or the end of the drive shaft, half shaft, axle shaft, whatever. So anyway, I did put anti-seize on those threads and turn that in with an impact wrench, and now it's good to go. Now I can put the wheel on.
Introducing the remarkably agile, entirely new 2001 Aurora by Oldsmobile. They can't escape praise.